How are you reading into it?
Absolutely, Tim. This was kind of a shock on Monday evening when we saw President-elect Trump first post on Truth Social about the tariff threat for Mexico as well as Canada and China. And we saw Prime Minister Trudeau immediately on the phone with the president-elect. We didn't see President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, connecting with him until the afternoon on Wednesday. And then we got this readout on Truth Social from the president-elect saying, we had a wonderful conversation. Mexico has agreed to close its border. Essentially, everything's great, and this completely different tone from what we had seen just 48 hours earlier. We later saw a readout from the Mexican president saying Mexico does not agree with closed borders. We are trying to address the migration issue through a humanitarian and a helping hand to the people who are coming, and to treating it in a very humane way, and through collaboration with the U.S., through finding jobs and opportunities for these people. And so, very different kind of description from both of these leaders as to what was agreed and what was understood by each side from the phone call that they had on Wednesday.
Eric, you spent a lot of time in Mexico. You've also spent a lot of time on the trade beat, so you understand how these things work. Tell us a little bit about her approach, because she seems to be mirroring Trump just a little bit in more recent days, bringing people on stage with her, for example, and saying, we have a plan too. And, the US will be hurt just as badly, if not worse, from the imposition of higher tariffs.
Absolutely, Vani. What we saw on Tuesday in terms of the initial reaction from the Mexican president was a message that I've really heard described by some Mexican officials as aimed at a domestic audience. This message was about defending Mexico's national dignity and pointing out that Mexico is a sovereign country, that Mexico has leverage. It's not just the U.S. that has leverage in this discussion, and that, as the president of Mexico said, if the U.S. applies a tariff, it will be followed by another tariff and another by each side, and you'll develop this trade war, which ultimately is not to the benefit of either side in terms of economic self-interest. Now, obviously, that was what the Mexican president said. That's not a message that necessarily historically has always been one that has registered with President Trump in the first term, in terms of trying to just inform and highlight statistics and the way that, what the actual numbers are saying about the problem. Because if we're looking at the numbers, the number of people arriving to the southwest U.S. border is currently, in recent months, has been at the lowest that it's been throughout the Biden administration. It's about 100,000 people per month, which is down about 66% from December of 2023, before Mexico made a greater effort. So Mexico highlighting in part they've already been making an effort. It's been lowering the numbers and trying in part to use such an information campaign and a persuasion campaign to point out to President-elect Trump the damage that the self-inflicted wound that it would be for American consumers, people who buy things like pickup trucks. The Mexican economy minister talking about the price of pickup trucks rising $3,000 per vehicle on average if these tariffs were imposed.
So break that down a little bit for us, because when that was announced earlier this week, or I think the president-elect posted on Truth Social about it, we did see shares of Ford take quite a hit. Shares of General Motors moved lower as well. Given your experience in Mexico, also your experience in Washington, D.C., what does our investing audience need to understand about the path of consumer goods that are at certain points built in Mexico and then shipped to the United States? Like, what does it look like as a trade partner?
Well, Tim, when I was covering the USMCA negotiations or the NAFTA renegotiation in Mexico in 2017 and 2018, part of the challenge is just the kind of mental gymnastics and math needed to figure out even how do these tariffs work when you have something like a chassis for a vehicle that, passes across borders several times in the manufacturing of that vehicle. And so you've got factories in South Carolina, in Alabama, in the U.S. South, or even in Michigan, where parts and where a vehicle during assembly crosses the border several times. And so there was a question back then about, well, Does the tariff get applied each time that that the vehicle is passing through? How do you even calculate this? And so, fortunately, at the time, cooler heads prevailed, and the U.S. did not withdraw from NAFTA as the president had threatened during the campaign in 2015, 2016. He sat down with the governments of Mexico and Canada and essentially renegotiated NAFTA, even though he's touted USMCA as a new deal. Everybody involved with it recognizes that it leans heavily on and contains a lot of the concepts and the agreements from NAFTA from the early 1990s, although updated to today's reality. So we've got a renegotiation of the USMCA that by law, as part of USMCA, actually a revision is supposed to happen by mid-2026. Each country's been debating exactly what that looks like, how deeply do they renegotiate, but President Trump making clear here, even 2 months before he gets into office, that he wants to see a lot of changes to the agreement that his own administration negotiated just 4 or 5 years ago.
Eric, I'm just curious because, Monterrey is really not very far over the border, and that's where a lot of factories are, including Tesla factories as well. How much of a chill is running through that city right now?
Well, Vani, certainly for the entirety of the Mexican economy, as Tim mentioned, the number of leaders who were flanking President Sheinbaum on the stage at the morning press conference at the National Palace on Wednesday morning. And I've been to Monterrey. I've spent a lot of time there, and I can tell you there are people whose livelihoods have been improved by the economic opportunities that have been made available to people in the north of Mexico in recent decades. Monterrey has the Tec de Monterrey, which is considered kind of the MIT of Mexico, that is graduating hundreds or thousands of engineers every year, many of whom go to work on some of these assembly lines. So the biggest thing that I think people there want people in the U.S. to understand is that it's not just low wages, it's not just a wage differential, even if that's part of it, but there's also a highly trained and highly educated workforce, particularly in the north of Mexico, that has been integrated into this regional economy, trading more than $1 trillion a year between all of the three countries in North America.